Hey guys, last video that I made, I talked about basically how I go about setting up every new project that I work on. So I talked about creating a virtual environment and the sort of skeleton main that I essentially stub into place. I'm going to go ahead today and write a quick utility that's going to go ahead, create a new project directory, create a virtual environment in it, add the gitignore file, and then install a couple of things in the virtual environment that I end up, using more or less every time I am starting a project. The only thing this utility is not going to do is basically putting in a simple main function that does nothing. I mentioned in the last video I thought that it was going to do that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it's just a few lines to type it. All these things are just a few lines to type. But most times I'm not going to just go in there and start typing, in main that's already there. I'm going to set out to accomplish something specific, so I'm going to have an idea in my mind of what I'm doing. It's not going to take that long for me to just type, the basic main. Also, I should say, I haven't mentioned this in a video so far, but I'm recording on a Mac Mini, you can tell that much. The thing does sound a little bit like an airplane as it heats up while I'm recording. I don't know why Apple hasn't figured out how to make something quiet. I don't really care. I'm just letting you know if you hear it in the background. I try to adjust the mic accordingly, but I don't want to hear you complain about it. This is a free video. Take it or leave it. Have a nice day. Whatever. Okay, so we're going to start in the terminal. So right now, I'm just in my home directory. If I list the contents, there's nothing here that is private or you can't see. I'm going to go ahead and just make this project. So for what it's worth, most of my projects, since I checked them into revision control, I put them in this Git repos directory. But for this project, I'm just going to go ahead and start it right here. So we're going to go ahead and call this utils. Now in the future, if I create anything else that is basically a utility, I'm going to just add it to this utils project. But for now, inside that utils, we're going to go ahead now, and of course, like we always do, we're going to go ahead and create a virtual environment. Once that's done, of course, we have to go ahead and source or activate it. Geez, it's taking its time now. There we go. Activate. Once I do that, almost always install AutoPep8 because I use it to format my code at the end, and then PyLint because if I don't have it, VS Code asks me to install it every time. But if I just put it there, it saves me having to click that button, and it saves me from having the pop up in every one of these damn videos that I make. So that's the reasoning there. All right, so hopping over to VS Code now, we're going to go ahead and open the folder that I just created. I realized also in the last video you can't see when I'm poking around in my file explorer to open the folder, but you can take my word for it. I'm opening the folder, and you can now see that. So go ahead, close the welcome, and then inside of utils, we're going to make a new file. We're just going to call it main.py. And again, just like every project, user bin env python3. And then we're going to go ahead and def main return. That just does nothing for now. If name equals main. So if you need an explanation for what this does, I'll go ahead and post a link in the description for this video to my last video where I go ahead and explain all of these things. Right? Okay, great. So what do we essentially have to do here? So the very first thing we want to do is we want to create a folder for our project, like I just did. That was the first thing I did, right? Make dir utils. So we're going to go ahead and import. Actually, before that, we have to tell our program where we want to create our project, right? Where we want to create the project. So I'm not going to go into a huge thing about argparse here. I do love argparse. I highly recommend argparse. But for what we're doing right now, we just need very simple command line argument. So we're going to import sys, and we're going to say here in our main sys.argv1. We're going to go ahead and say directory equals sys.argv1. And essentially what this does right here is this will set the variable directory equal to whatever our first command line argument is. And now you're asking me, list start at 0, Jonathan, so why are you saying 1? Well, in Python and most languages, the very first argument is always the name of the script. So in our case, if I were to say sys.argv0 here, it would set directory equal to main.py. So the first argument is the first, or the second one on the list, but argument 1 here is the first thing that we pass as a user. And so if I just go ahead here and say print directory, I save this, and then I tab over to the terminal, and I type Python 3 main.py, and I type hello, it's going to go ahead and just print hello because that's the first argument. Also, as you can see here, I just typed Python 3 main.py, but the whole reason we add that shebang as the first line is so we don't have to type Python 3 100 times. However, on Mac OS and Linux, that means we have to mark our file as executable before we can just go ahead and run it. So if I don't do that, if I just say main.py hello, I go ahead and get permission denied because it's not executable. But +x main.py, now I go ahead and do that, and it works just fine. Great. So that was the very first step. We needed to make sure we actually knew what directory we were acting on. So I'm going to get rid of this print that was just for debugging and demonstrative purposes. But the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and make a directory for my project. And so my one argument in this case is actually going to be a path to a directory. So we're going to go ahead, start a new function, and we're going to say, just call it make project dir, and it's going to take a single argument called directory. And at the end of the day, it's probably not going to return anything. We'll see here. But what do we really want this to do? So we want to say, okay, so we need another import here. So again, these are a lot of packages I use all the time in scripting as a sysadmin. So I know a lot about sys and OS and a bunch of other libraries that you'll see me just kind of know I have to import. In your case, you might have to Google make directory with Python or something like that. But as a part of OS, we have os.makeDirs, and then we can pass it our directory from our argument to our function. And essentially, if we just go ahead and add that and then save this, then, one more thing. We have to actually call our function, right? So in main, I realized I just did both of these in the wrong place. See, I am not perfect, guys, and you will definitely find this. So I'm not going to ever edit these types of things out. If it was colossally bad, I might restart the video, but everybody who programs does these silly little things once in a while, so I'm going to leave those in because it's important that you see that everyone makes mistakes, and it's important sometimes that you see how they're fixed. In this case, I just ran them in my if name equals main instead of running them in my main function that I want. So next thing, make project dir, and then we're going to just pass in directory. So to follow the flow real quick, starting on line 10, we define our main function. We set the variable directory equal to sys.argv1. Realistically, we could just pass sys.argv1 directly here, but this is just for clarity. Yes, it's an extra step. At the end of the day, it's not using a whole lot more in terms of resources. It makes our code more readable, so it's worthwhile. And then we're going to say make project dir directory that calls our make project dir function. And the only thing that function does is goes ahead and makes a directory that we've specified. So making sure this is saved, going over to the terminal, I'm going to type main.py, and then I'm going to go ahead and say users Jonathan utils. So this is our current working directory. And then I'm going to say my new dir. And if I go ahead and run that, of course it returns with no output. But if I list the contents, I can see it's gone ahead and created my new dir. Great, we did one whole thing. I'm going to go ahead and remove that directory. Also, I am very seasoned, and this is a machine I don't care about and a project I don't care about, so using RMRF just saves me some time while I'm recording. But realistically, you probably want to use RM-R, and it will ask you to confirm, and you want to press yes, and don't be an asshole like me. All right. Anyway, back to VS Code. So, great, we made a project directory. One thing that I want to point out. So let's say I go ahead and run that again, create my new dir, and then I run it a second time. Well, what we see is that we get this kind of ugly error from Python that just says, hey, this file already exists. So reasonably, we want to handle this error to make the output a little bit nicer. In this case, the consequences, because it won't overwrite the directory, it doesn't actually really matter if we don't handle this exception, but we want it to look nice and kind of be informative when something like this happens. So first thing we're going to do is fix that. So we remove the new directory, we go back to VS Code, and if you haven't heard of try and except before, it is the way that we handle exceptions in Python. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details. I'm just going to kind of do it and give you an example, and you can go read about it on your own if you want. So first thing we say is try, and then this is kind of like a loop where we have to indent. So we want to try to make this directory. And then what we want to do is say except, and then specifically, if we go back to the terminal here, it gives us this first, the first line of this last part of the output here is, or the first thing, file exists error. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy that. And when I go back to VS Code, I want to say I want to accept a file exists error. Now, you can just say accept without specifying a specific error, but I don't recommend doing that, because if you don't know every possible exception that os.makeDirs in this case could throw, you might really be shooting yourself in the foot if you say accept. And so what are we going to do here? Essentially, we're going to say accept file exists error. I don't know why VS Code is complaining at me. Invalid syntax. Well, that's just not true, I don't think. Okay, anyway, we're going to keep going. So if our file already exists, we're going to go ahead and issue a print and say the directory you provided already exists, not doing anything. And then we don't want anything else to happen in our program. We just want to exit, but we probably want to exit with a non-exit or a non-zero exit status. So traditionally in computing land, if something finishes successfully, the exit status of the main function is 0. But we specifically are saying there's an error, so we're going to go ahead and exit 1. So if I go ahead now and because I'm exiting 1 here, the return is never going to happen. The whole program is going to exit right here. So I'm going to go back to the terminal. I'm going to go ahead and run my main.py. It works the first time. What happens if I run it again? Well, this time I get this nice error message. And then in Linux and macOS, this is how we can check the exit status. So if I go ahead and echo this special variable, I can see it exited 1, which is what I specified. So this is doing exactly what we want. It's a much nicer output. It's not vomiting at us like up here. And that's great. All right, go ahead, remove my new dir. And you're going to see me remove this directory a whole bunch of times because we're going to keep testing as we go. I recommend you always find a way to test as you go. Don't make 100 changes and add 4 functions and not test them as you go, because it makes it a lot harder to debug where an issue is happening. Okay, so great, we made our project directory. What is the next step every time that I work on a Python project? And I actually didn't do it at the beginning of this video because, again, I'm imperfect. It is what it is. But from my last video, the next thing that I always do is I go ahead and I add a gitignore file to my project directory. And the reason for this is because I almost always put my code into revision control, and I don't want my virtual environment or any kind of cached Python files to get uploaded to my Git repository. And by the way, I will also always link to my Git repositories if applicable in the description. This video I will link to, as well. So we're gonna make a new function, def get gitignore. And then that's going to take a single argument also, directory, right? And again, how are we gonna do this? Well, first of all, we already have our directory made and everything like that. So what do we wanna do? We wanna download a file from the internet using Python. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to just paste in our URL for right here. And I have this saved somewhere else so that I don't have to go to GitHub and copy and paste it right now. But if you just go to Google, type in Python gitignore, you will find it. Okay, it's kind of a long link. So how do we download a file in Python? Well, like lots of things in Python and lots of languages, there's a couple of ways to do it. But in particular, we are going to go ahead and use a directory called urllib.request. And basically, they provide a sort of wget or curl equivalent that will just download the file. So we're going to say urllib.request.url retrieve, and you can see my editor helps me complete that. And then we pass in the URL, and then we're going to utilize OS one more time, because what we really want is to specify the entire directory, or the entire file name that we want to save this file to, as a full path. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say os.path.join, and what this will do is basically give us a valid Unix path with as many elements as we give it. So we're going to say directory, which is the argument we passed in. And then, so if we just left it like this, it would be trying to write this file to a file with the same name as our directory. So in my case, it'd be, users, Jonathan, utils, my tester. But we also want to add .gitignore. So this will actually add now the file type. I have an extra parenthesis there. And then it will return. So then we have to make sure we add the function to our main. So next thing we do is gitignore, and we pass the directory again. And some people would say, well, with something this simple, why don't you just make directory a global argument and use it wherever you need to use it? Yes, I could absolutely do that, but that's not nearly as modular as passing it as an argument into the function. Because in theory, if I wrote other utilities that could utilize this make projector or gitignore function, I want to be able to pass variables into those, because those, my directory might not be defined globally in that case. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save, go back to the terminal again, and I'm just going to go ahead and run my main.py. And what we're going to see is it returns again very quickly. But this time, if I go into my.udir and I ls-a, because .gitignore is a hidden file with the the period in front of it, I'm going to go ahead and see. Dot is the current directory, dot is the directory above, and then .gitignore is the file we just looked at. And if I use less to actually view this file, you can see there's a bunch of stuff in here. So we're making good progress. Right now we make a directory, we get a gitignore file and place it in there. We have two more things to do. So the first one is we want to make a new virtual environment. So we're just going to keep chugging along here. And again, I try to be kind of consistent with my naming. So make Vem. Now, one thing you'll notice is I'm not giving any kind of flexibility here to name the virtual environment, because I always name my virtual environment Vem unless I'm trying to test with multiple or something like that. But this is just to start, my most standard project, right? So I can use this script, call it when I need it, and that'll be that. So once again, we're going to use os.path.join. So we're going to define what is the Vem dir that we actually want to create. And again, I just said that I always call it Vem. So we're going to do os.path.join. And just like the gitignore, first we're going to give it our directory. So this is the top level of our project. And then we're going to just append Vem to it. So this is the full path to where we want our virtual environment to be. And then the next step is, you guessed it, importing a library. So Vem is pretty interesting, and we're going to talk about that more when we write the next function. But in this case, we have a function that we can use called, or a method of Vem called vem.create, and it takes it takes a minimum of one argument, I believe, but we're going to specify two. So first, it wants the directory where we're going to actually make our Vem. Mdir equals vemdir. That's a little bit awkward. And then the other thing is that we want to make sure is that we want to make sure that you can see in the pop-up from VS Code that with pip by default will be false. Well, we want pip to be available inside of our virtual environment that we create, because essentially we want to be able to install packages with pip. Sorry, tripping over my words a little bit. And then in this case, we're actually going to make a return, and we're going to, because we've already taken the time to define this vemdir, we're going to go ahead and return that string so that we can use it later. So when we go ahead and call this function in our main, we're just going to say vem equals make vem, and again, we pass in our base directory to this function. Save. Over to the terminal. You're getting tired of this yet? RMRF my.udir. This is the old one from our last test. We go ahead and we run it again. Oh, we see it's taking quite a bit longer this time. And you saw how long it took to create my virtual environment at the beginning of this video, so this seems like a good sign. So I go into my.udir. If I type ls, Sure enough, we have a virtual environment. Now, I already have sourced my virtual environment for this utils project, so I'm doing a little inception thing here by having a project in a project. So I'm going to deactivate my current virtual environment. So if I type which pip right now, you can see it's not even found. But now if I activate this new virtual environment and I type which pip, you can see that it's pointing to the virtual environment that we just created with our Python. Now, I'll point out one other thing. If you don't know about this, pip freeze will always print out a list of packages in your current virtual environment if you're in one. Or if you're not in one, it'll print out all the Python packages you have at sort of a system level. So right now you can see we just created a virtual environment. There's nothing in it, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and deactivate that. I'm going to get rid of my new dir. I'm going to go ahead and reactivate my virtual environment for the project. Actually, I'm going to skip this because we're going to keep messing around with the new one anyway. And I'm not actually using it for anything. I'm not installing anything that's not already a part of the standard library. So again, it's just habit for me to create the virtual environment. VS Code will still use it, so the PyLint stuff is going to be fine. I hope that's not confusing for anybody. Now, the last step of this is we want to install AutoPEP8 and PyLint inside of our newly created virtual environment. And you might ask, why didn't you just do this as part of your make venv function? There's a couple of reasons. First of all, though, venv as a module does provide this nice method for creating a virtual environment. Awesome. Why, I don't know. I don't know why, but the Python developers, they don't let you use any kind of internal method to install packages in a virtual environment. So we have to do something that I feel is a little hacky, but it's actually how the Python developers want you to do it. And that is, we're going to use subprocess, which is how we basically call something from the underlying shell within our Python. So we're just going to make a new function called preparevenv. And rather than taking our base directory, because we have our venv dir on line 32 now, this is actually going to take our virtual environment as an argument. Oops, I got an extra parenthesis. And so what is this going to do? Well, first of all, we want to make sure we're using the pip within the virtual environment and not a system pip. We don't want to install these packages system-wide. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define this new variable called which pip. And the reason I'm calling it that is because of, like in the terminal, where I did which pip right here, and it wasn't found. Similarly, as I did it here, you can see inside the virtual environment. So we want to make sure we're pointing at this pip after we create the virtual environment, and not whatever pip may have been found here if there was one. Okay, so which pip equals, and here's our friend os.path.join, and we're going to start with the venv, and then in my terminal, if I go into the existing virtual environment that I have, and I list the contents of it, there's a bin directory. And if I look in the bin directory, here we go. Here's pip, pip3, pip3.8. These are all symlinks for the same thing. But essentially, so we're going to join venv, and then bin, and then pip. And this is now going to point out the path to our virtual environment /bin/pip, which is the binary we actually want to be using. Great. All right, so the next thing we want to do is basically run a pip install from the underlying shell. So this is going to be, in bash, or in my case, ZSH, whichever shell you're calling the Python from. And again, that's because the Python developers don't give us some kind of nice internal method for installing a package. So we need yet another import, something called subprocess. And subprocess essentially allows us to spawn subprocesses in the calling shell and blah, blah, blah. Subprocess can be extremely complicated. We're going to do a very basic example. I'm not going to go into too many details about that right now, but you have to take my word for it. And so specifically, we're going to use something called subprocess.checkOutput. And that will return a bytes-like object of the output from the command. So we're going to capture it, but we're not going to actually do anything with it. It could be useful for debugging. It could be useful if I extend this later, or if you extend this later. But just know, yes, I'm defining a variable output. I'm not actually doing anything with it. And to be totally transparent, there is a way that I could run subprocess.run, and I could not check the output. But I'm just doing this as like a future-proofing measure, so please don't jump down my throat. Okay, and then subprocess.check output. And this minimally, again, takes a list of your command and its arguments. So in our case, we want to call our pip binary from up here. So our command is actually which pip. And then the first argument is install. And then the second argument is a package name. So again, I already told you I want to install AutoPep8. And then if I wanted to install another package, I could add another argument. So pylint. And so that's a little bit of a long line. But if I go ahead and save that, now the last thing I have to do, of course, is add it to my main so it actually runs. And then I'll say prepare venv. And now again, if I were trying to sort of future-proof this, I'd probably return the output as part of this function. But since we're not actually going to use it right now, I'm just leaving it as a blank return. You can do whatever you want with it, but I'm leaving it like this for now. So this is the last step here. Once I go ahead and run this again, we're going to create a directory. We're going to add a git ignore. We're going to create a virtual environment. And now our last step is to actually install a couple of packages in the virtual environment using the correct pip, which is the one that is actually in the bin directory of the virtual environment. So I'm making sure that I don't still have my new dir from before. I do not. And now I'm going to press the up arrow about 80 times like a fool. I was actually close. 81. All right. And then go ahead and run this. And again, you're going to see it take some time because we know that it does take some time to create a virtual environment. And once it returns, okay, it actually spits out a warning. We're using an old version of pip. Do we care right now? No, we don't care right now. So when I go ahead and ls, I go inside my new dir. You can see there's a virtual environment here. We're going to go ahead and activate it or source it. And the reason for that, okay, so again, which pip? We know it's the right one. Great. But you remember before my pip freeze command, which didn't print anything out because I hadn't installed anything. We go ahead and run that now, and you can see AutoPep8 and pylint. And the reason you see more packages there is because both pylint and AutoPep8 have dependencies that have now gotten installed, so they get explicitly listed. And so if we wanted to really bring this all together, I guess the last step of this, in my opinion, would be moving this somewhere that we can actually make use of it. So I'm going to just do this very quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But in my home directory, man, I thought I already had this, but I guess I don't. All right, well, great. So we're going to go ahead and say make dir bin. And then we're going to go ahead and copy users Jonathan utils main.py into bin/start project, right? And we don't need that .py extension because we have our shebang in there. So all we want to do is we want to make sure that the executable bit is set, which it is. That's what this little X is. And then what do we want to do? Well, we want to make sure that our bin directory is actually in our path variable. And this is how, our operating system finds binaries and other libraries and such within our environment. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about environment here. And I'll also say that if I run this right now, this is not going to be permanent. When I close this terminal and open it back up, it's going to be gone. But if you're curious about how to do this permanently, look into ZSH-RC or bash-RC or bash profile, depending on your distribution, and you can do that. But if I start tab completing now, so I just type start and press tab, you can now see the start project just shows up. And I'm not actually calling it directly. I'm not in the bin directory or my project directory. So just to test it, start project, users, Jonathan, another test. Again, and it's going to take a second, and I feel bad making you sit through this because it's a little bit painful, and we're at a half hour already, but this is going to be the last thing, I promise. I think. There we go. We get our warning. Go ahead inside another test, and there we have our virtual environment. So this has been I'm going to go ahead and remove my another test, deactivate my virtual environment from my testing before. This is where I'm going to leave it. If anybody has questions about environment management or anything like that, feel free to let me know in the comments. I will link in the description to the previous video where I explained how I go about starting every project. And I think that just about wraps it up. I'll also link to the source code in the description. Sorry. Thanks for watching.